please sit on the dais. Dr. Vijay Chauthewale is in charge of the Department of Foreign Affairs, BJP, since November 2014. In this role, he is coordinating with the Indian diaspora worldwide through BJP's global outreach platform. Dr. Vijay Chauthewale is also a member of various committees like Board of Governors of Indian Institute of Management, Raipur, Research Council of Central Drug Research Institute, Lucknow. Dr. Vijay Chauthewale is PhD Microbiology from University of Pune with 4 years experience as a postdoctoral fellow at National Institutes of Health, USA. Sir is co-editor of 2 books entitled Hindutva in Present Context and The Modi Doctrine, New Paradigms in India's Foreign Policy. Sir is also a regular columnist on various national and international issues. His columns are present in the Asian Age, Indian Express, The Print, The Quint, and vernacular media. It's an honor to have you with us, sir. I would like to request Nishant Gupta to welcome Dr. Vijay Chauthewale. Please give a big round of applause. Thank you, sir. I request Dr. Vijay Chauthewale to speak on India's foreign policy, emerging dimensions.
Respected Pro Vice Chancellor of Pune University, Professor Umrani, other faculty members, Shri Maratheji, with whom you are collaborating, and also various officials of Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, and my friends. It is but natural that today's talk should start on a broader perspective of foreign policy. What I plan to do is to give a snapshot of foreign policy issues in last 4 years or so. I will also touch upon the soft power aspect at the end, and then maybe in a little interactive session we will try to discuss if you have any queries in your mind after my talk. So, Namaskar Ashish ji. First of all, let us be very clear that when we talk about foreign policy, it is inherent that the word policy is in it. So it's not an ideology. No one talks about foreign ideology. And the policy is changed over a period of time. For example, in 10 years, 15 years back, we have a socialist economic model. Now we are much more open to the capitalist model. Our education system has changed. Our education policy has changed. Similarly, foreign policy also needs to be changed over a period of time, mainly because of what we aspire to do, and also many times in external conditions also change. So it's a combination of both. So first we need to be very clear that there is no aspect of foreign policy that it is rigid and it cannot be changed. With this, now if we try to understand what different thing various people have done in last 70 years or so since our independence, we'll realize that we have also changed over a period of time. When there was a Cold War, we adhered to a policy of something called as a non-alignment, which means that neither we are towards the pro-capitalist US and Europe, nor we are aligned with the communist bloc, which was also equally predominant in the other part of the world. But as the Cold War ended, the non-alignment itself has lost its relevance. And if you see, still there is quote-unquote non-alignment summit that happens every alternate year or so. But India's participation and in the relative importance to NAM summits in the overall scheme of things, have gone down drastically. I don't remember in last 5 7 years, Indian Prime Minister has actually attended NAM summit, even though it is happening on a regular basis. Generally, some junior minister goes. So, non-alignment movement has been quite deprioritized by India's foreign policy establishment, not by Modi government, but even before that, because the time changed. And that is only one example. I can tell you, we were very adherent to non-proliferation or not having nuclear arms at one time of point, and we used to take a pride of it that we have nuclear technology, but we don't have nuclear arms. But now the situation has changed, and we are now openly saying that yes, we are nuclear power. So there are several examples that I can give, but that's not the crux of today's talk. It is just to emphasize that the policies do change for national interest, and also sometimes as a compulsion of external environment. For example, we want to be very friendly with Pakistan, but when Pakistan is supporting terrorism and anti-India activities very openly, it will be very naive on our part to talk about only friendship, etc. So we have to be tough with Pakistan. So these are external environments which compel us in spite of our intentions being different. Same thing can happen with the refugees. So again, I will focus right now on the last 4 years of Indian government foreign policy. I will keep a broader perspective of that, try to highlight the entire policy. Entire policy paradigm in 3 or 4 themes, so as to give a broad messages rather than going into details of everything, because it's not also possible to talk about everything in 30-40 minutes. But before going into it, we also need to know, and I'm telling you purely on a fact and not because I belong to a particular political party, that is BJP, that what was the situation when this government came into the power. And that is the baseline. You all know what is the importance of baseline. Unless we know what is the baseline, we don't know what is the change, positive or negative. So let me tell you some statistics. We all talk about having friendly relations with all over the world. But before Modi government came into the power, no Indian leader, when I say Indian leader, that means specifically the Prime Minister or President, visited Nepal, which is our closest country where we can go without visa, for 17 years. With Sri Lanka, no Prime Minister went to Sri Lanka for 28 years. Australia, 28 years. Canada, 42 years. Only Prime Minister Manmohan Singh went there, but he went for G20 meeting, not for a bilateral. UAE, our closest commercial partner, no one went there for 34 years. And there are countries like Mongolia, Israel, where no Indian leader ever visited. It was Narasimha Rao who actually started diplomatic relations with Israel. So we recognized Israel as soon as it became liberated, that is in 48, 49, something like that. But diplomatic relations, thus establishing embassies in each other's country, that initiative didn't take place between Nehru and Narasimha Rao, because we were scared that it will somehow hurt Arab countries. But after establishing diplomatic relations, first time Israel Prime Minister visited India was during Atal Bihari Vajpayee's regime. And first time Indian Prime Minister visited Israel was in 2016 when Prime Minister Modi went there. So this is a kind of foreign policy gap we have witnessed, in last 40 years, especially in the last 10 years of Mr. Manmohan Singh. In 2009, I would say that there was a peak and there was best of Indian foreign policy emerged when India signed a civil nuclear deal with America. You might be knowing that that has actually enabled India to get a lot of technologies pertaining to nuclear power, especially in the terms of nuclear energy. And that was a very big effort where we are talking now about soft power. The India's soft power in US in terms of India's power in diaspora has showed enormous amount of energy, enthusiasm, and the unity. When this bill has gone to US Congress, because there was a lot of opposition from various lobbies, so US congressmen were also under tremendous pressure from anti-India forces. But 2009, the Indian diaspora came together. It worked very closely with Indian diplomats, and they convinced American lawmakers to vote in favor of civil nuclear deal, the passage of which was essential for actually execution of the agreement. That was a peak of Indian foreign policy establishment that happened just before 2009 general elections. What happened after that was essentially immediate rock bottom of Indian foreign policy. In August-September 2009, there was a summit in the Egyptian resort, big seashore resort called Sharm el Sheikh, where Indian Prime Minister Mr. Manmohan Singh and Pakistani Prime Minister Yusuf Gilani that time signed a joint statement. And why I'm saying that that was the lowest point in Indian foreign policy was that first time India has said that, okay, you can continue supporting terrorism, but we will still talk to you. And I can actually quote you the actual lines of that statement. That's in July 2009. Both Prime Ministers recognized that dialogue is the only way forward. Action on terrorism should not be linked to the composite dialogue. And these should not be bracketed. Prime Minister Singh said that India was ready to discuss all issues with Pakistan, including all outstanding issues. So essentially, the foreign policy, what we had passed, and now we are continuing, that we cannot have talks and terrorism together. The Prime Minister Manmohan Singh actually considered that field to Pakistan. And since then, the second stint of Manmohan Singh government was actually a big failure as far as foreign policy is concerned. So when we started in 2014 on this background, what Prime Minister has achieved, Prime Minister Modi has achieved in the last 4 years is something very outstanding. And I would like to again focus 3 or 4 themes in that, and then we talk about how the soft power comes into the context. First of all, what has happened is that there is a tight integration between India's domestic policies and India's foreign policy, which used to work in two different silos in past. For example, all India's programs, domestic programs like Digital India, like Startup India, all that now have become a part of India's foreign policy, and how the global digital community can be integrated with India. Indian ambitions in the digital technology, digital highways is now very well integrated. Even the things like Swachh Bharat has now become our global program, and a lot of foreign companies or foreign institutions, foreign governments are now bringing clean technologies in India. So Swachh Bharat, which otherwise used to be thought of only removing the kachra from the streets, has now become a global program as far as India is concerned. That is number one. Second part was what we have done is to overcome the historical hesitations. What I mean by historical hesitations is again a classical example of Israel, which I gave, that Indian government and Indian establishment used to think that if we work with Israel, if we set up good relations with Israel, it will have two impacts. One is that we will spoil our relations with Arab countries, on which we are dependent largely for the petroleum and petroleum products. And politically, it will also hurt us domestically because of the vote bank politics. What Modi government has done is that we have established very good relations with Israel, and the latest example being that when last week our former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee died, and when Israel Prime Minister has written a condolence note on it, he has personally written, you must have seen its photograph on the Twitter, that he wrote, "My friend Narendra," which means there is a considerable personal chemistry between Mr. Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi. But at the same time, we have now exceptionally good relations with all the Gulf countries. Two major Gulf countries who are actually at a loggerheads with each other, Iran and Saudi Arabia, both have given their highest civilian awards, which is equivalent to Bharat Ratna in India, to Prime Minister Modi. Our relations with UAE, for example, is at the peak. And to give an example, last year you must have seen again that UAE government has given permission to build a big Hindu temple in Abu Dhabi. And since then I am following the progress of that project very closely. Thanks to the very good relations between two countries and Crown Prince of UAE and Prime Minister Modi, they have given so many exemptions to build this temple. Otherwise, it was unheard of in UAE history that something else of this sort will be built upon. And that could be possible only because now we have very good relations. And there are so many examples like this, that these historical hesitations we have overcome. And we are now talking to these countries on our terms, in our interest, rather than getting bogged down between what are they fighting with each other, or are they friendly with each other. And this is the crux of successful foreign policy, that we are doing what is in interest of India, rather than looking at the conflict or friendship between two different countries. So this one is, I guess, the second most important achievement of Indian foreign policy. Third is, of course, to give example, is the surgical strikes. Again, we used to be always worried that if we do any military actions against Pakistan, it will be retaliated. And therefore, we were always on a defensive side as far as infiltration is concerned, as far as terrorist support from Pakistan is concerned. But surgical strike has shown that we can actually do something which we have never done before and which is never heard of in Indian history. And we were always used to be thinking that docile country, which will be always on put a defensive posturing. Instead of that, we have now shown that we can actually act proactively. And to tell you what is the philosophy behind it, our National Security Advisor, in an informal discussion, has very aptly said to me and few others that it doesn't matter how much power we have. What matters is that our willingness to exert that power. And this is what we have shown by surgical strikes. Here I come to little bit bring a soft power issue into this. Because what I want to emphasize here, and if you ask me what is one takeaway message from my talk, is that you cannot distinguish soft power or work in isolation on soft power without having hard power. So there has to be a very good combination of hard power and soft power. And we are very proud of our soft power, and in previous speeches also we have, he has, lot of discussion we have done on what all the soft power aspects of it. But I'll tell you another aspect, because you are a student, you should always challenge everything. Last year, again I am giving Israel example, Mr. Netanyahu was in India, and he gave a very famous talk in the big conclave called Raisina Dialogue. And he openly said that soft power is good, but hard power is better. And we believe in hard power. So that is their philosophy, that is their policy. We are not that extreme, but at the same time, unless we have the strength, both militarily, both financially, and diplomatically, purely talking of soft power doesn't have that much of impact. To extend the argument, I can tell you that we have all these soft power components like education. We had IITs for 60 years. We have yoga, we had dances, we have culture, we have music, everything. But we couldn't show our impact on the world and the global geopolitics as much as we are showing in last 5 years, only because now we are able to combine both of these. So please take a note of this, that soft power is good, it is required, it is essential, but it is not sufficient. And therefore, with that context, when now we talk about soft power, without going into the overall foreign policy issues, and I can go on talking about it, one more aspect of soft power which we have harnessed very well, and I am fortunate to get involved into it directly, was our strength of our diaspora. We have around 3 crore people, 30 million people of Indian origin spread across the globe. And they are not a uniform lot. We think that all these people are IT experts who graduated from engineering colleges in India and went to work for Microsoft or Siemens or NASA or American establishment. That's not the case. Indian diaspora has a history of over 150 years. Initially, many of the people from states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, or even Andhra, they were taken as laborers by Britishers. And you might not be knowing that Britishers were very good in documentation. And they were, in spite of all their atrocities they have committed in India, they were also system driven. So all of them, those who have gone as a laborers, they signed agreement with them. These people were semi-literate or illiterate. They didn't know anything except Hindi or their mother tongue. And those agreements were in English. And these people, they couldn't even pronounce the word agreement. So they abbreviated it as a GRIMIT, agreements abbreviation. So, and those documents are still available with many people, and they are archived. And all these people are in fact called as Girimitiads, because they went with Britishers on the basis of some agreement. And they are based in West Indian islands like Suriname, Trinidad, in Malaysia, not Malaysia, sorry, Mauritius, in South Africa, and many other parts of the country, Fiji. And these people now, they have gone there for 5-7 generations. They know the culture of India. They know Ramcharitmanas, for that example. They also know Bollywood nowadays, but they have not visited India for several generations. Many of them, they don't even know now from which village or city they have originated from. But with the communication age, they are trying to come together. They are trying to find their origin again. Many people who cannot read Hindi, but they watch all Bollywood movies. They watch all the Sasbhu soap operas on TVs. And I've met, especially if you travel to Amsterdam, you will find a lot of Surinamese driver. And as soon as you tell them that you are from India, they will say they will start talking to you in Hindi. They may even tune the FM Hindi channel on the radio, and they will tell you what is the latest episode of all these Sasbo soap operas, which you also might not be aware of. So these are the ways they are trying to connect with India for a long period of time. And then there are series of doctors have gone, nurses have gone. For example, in Israel, I was shocked to know that there are 10,000 Indian nurses of Indian passport holders. They are serving the old age patients in Israel at a home care. So this is a very fascinating story of Indian diaspora without going into much of the details of that. What I am trying to tell you that diaspora has now become a big asset for us. How? That when Prime Minister Modi went to Canada, Canadian then Prime Minister Mr. Harper wanted to present in the diaspora event of Canada in Toronto. Why? Because there were elections coming up, and he thought that these people can be vote catcher for me. Because they vote in, because Canada, the number is small, but Canadian population is small, so they constitute around 3% of Canadian population. Same thing happened in UK. Just to tell you an example, Prime Minister Modi's event in UK at Wembley Stadium, where 60,000 people came. Just a week before that, we went to meet then British Prime Minister David Cameron and to formally invite him to come to the program. And he said very astonishingly that you people are saying me that Mr. Modi is coming and he is giving going to speak in front of 60,000 people at Wembley. If I myself go to Wembley, I won't be able to fill a town hall of Wembley, which has a capacity of 1,000 people. So this is the kind of force that diaspora has shown only because of they got a new identity, both as a political force, both as a financial force. If you go to US, for example, you must have heard all the names of Satya Nadella and Indra Nooyi and Shantanu Narayanan of Adobe, who are the top CEOs of big companies. But below that, there are hundreds of professionals, businessmen, industrialists, who are doing fantastic work in their own field, and also they are contributing a lot to India by supporting their schools, by supporting the hospitals in their native villages, building the roads, building the toilets. So when I say that there is a tight integration between India's foreign policy and soft power, this is what a very classic example, and I can give you hundreds of examples of this kind where people are doing below the radar activities to contribute in the development and growth of India, and also doing a lot of philanthropic work. The third part of soft is definitely a yoga, which has now reached a global proportion. And I don't have to elaborate it because it is very well established that yoga, which was, again, there was an appeal, but someone has to instigate a sense of purpose to that appeal. And that is what Prime Minister Modi has done it. And one example I will give, which is very heartwarming, that in Saudi Arabia, there is a lady called, she herself is a doctor, Marwa. This girl is teaching yoga in Saudi Arabia. There was a lot of opposition and even threats, and she was prosecuted for blasphemy because they have very strict Islamic laws. And they said that through the yoga, she's actually trying to propagate something which is not Islamic. Fortunately for her, the government was supportive of her. She has come out of all this prosecution, and with her effort, now Saudi government has recognized yoga as the sport. And what's the importance of it is that because it is recognized as a sport, which means that you cannot have the spiritual or religious aspects of yoga, like chanting of Om, etc., because that is not allowed in an Islamic country. But you can still practice yoga formally, train them, open the yoga club as a sport training, etc. And this lady, now there, if you Google her, you will find that she herself wear hijab, and she teaches yoga to Saudi women who are also wearing, they do practice yoga wearing hijab. And Prime Minister, our government has recognized her 2 years back by giving Padma Shri. She is a Saudi citizen. So this is the kind of changes that are occurring. So when you say that yoga is only popular in the West, in the European countries or in US, that's not the case. It is now popular and being practiced all over the world, including the Islamic countries. This is kind of something which we should be proud of. Bollywood is another example of India's soft power, and you will see its footprints everywhere in the world. My daughter, during she was here in Ferguson, and she went on one exchange program few years back in Germany, and as a part of that, she was staying in one German family, and that family also had a girl of same age. And when she entered her room, she found Shah Rukh Khan all over her room. And she had German dubbing of practically each film of Shah Rukh Khan. And that's not something unique. It is very common that people are, you know, the story of Dangal movie of Amir Khan being one of the super hits in China, for that matter. So Bollywood is now becoming a very big way to convey what India stands for. And all these big things which we may not find it very attractive, people are understanding India through Bollywood. So these are all aspects of soft power, which I am sure we will discuss it in the later sessions. I don't want to go into every part of it. I'll just tell you one example that how being Indian has become a matter of pride. And largely, again, I am telling you the credit goes to this government because of so many things they have done, and I can go on listing it. But I'll just tell you one example. I was in Nairobi once, early morning at the airport, and I was just doing some shopping at Nairobi airport before I fly out. So when I went to the cash counter, which was a small shop, Nairobi airport is also quite small, there was a young black guy on the cash counter. So he curiously asked me from where you are coming. So I said, from India. So as soon as I said, I am from India, he said, oh, India, Mr. Modi. So I said, yes, Mr. Modi. Next he said, he is a young guy, he never traveled outside Kenya anytime. He said, you know, man, in typical African accent, you know, man, we need 4 or 5 Modis in the world to change the world. And I was astonished. Then just to raise his curiosity, I said, Mr. Modi is going to visit your country next month. He was not aware of it. But then he said, oh, really? Tell me the date. I will take a day off to take his picture. So that is the kind of curiosity India and Mr. Modi in person has raised all over the world. And this is a universal example. You will find wherever you go, anywhere in the world, that people all over the world are looking towards India with lot of expectations, lot of aspirations, and lot of hope that this is the country which can be not only a leader but also a very big contributor in the global prosperity and peace. I guess this is the real essence of software. I don't mean to say that everything has happened in last 4 years. Let us not take that message. People are doing it for ages. For example, if you go to Silicon Valley, you will see software engineers are doing a lot of contribution in the local economy, not only giving back money to India, but at local level also they are doing. I know the Indian people in US who are working now in the black communities and try to help them to get the education through the music, through the yoga, and also do de-addiction. So they are not only contributing, they are not remaining only introvert, but they are also now going out and contributing to the local society. And again, what Professor Umrani has said, that what matters at the end is the values. That Indian values of compassion, Indian values of respecting the elders, assuming that all humanity is a kind of brotherhood. We always say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. They are all now becoming a big asset for Indians all over the world. I was just talking because coincidentally next month I am going to give a talk on diaspora in one of the TEDx conclaves. So for that I am informally talking to my several friends and especially the second generation who have born in different countries. And I'm asking them one question very repeatedly. And I am saying that, are you comfortable with your Indian identity or Indian origin? And I have yet to find one person who said that they are not comfortable or he or she is not comfortable. They are extremely comfortable with their Indian origin. Why? Because again, we are very comfortable with multiple identities. For example, I myself, I am born in Nagpur. I did most of my education in Pune, and you know how much difference in Pune and Nagpur is, because when I came and started talking in Marathi here, people used to laugh at me, my Marathi also, being in the same state, because my Nagpur Marathi has a very heavy Hindi influence. Then I went to Gujarat, now I am in Delhi. So we can speak multiple languages. We are very comfortable with it. We pray multiple gods and goddesses. We are not too fussy about praying only Rama or Shiva or Devi. We are happy with it. One day we will celebrate Ganesh Chaturthi, next day we will celebrate Garba, third day we will celebrate Onam. And we don't see the conflicts in it. Therefore, the diaspora also, people of Indian origin also, they are very comfortable of their Indian origin. They take the values out of it. They take the sanskars out of it. And at the same time, they are very comfortable with their where they are based in, and they contribute it loyally. And therefore, everywhere in the world, Indians are seen as the law-abiding citizens. Not only they are prosperous, but they are also law-abiding citizens. The crime rate is lowest among Indians in most of the part of the world. And that is something to do, again, I am emphasizing, is because of the values, because of our heritage, because of our culture. And that, I guess, is the strongest soft power, which when combined with the strategic power, military power, and economic power of India, our country is rising to one of the most aspiring countries in the world. Thank you very much.
Sir is now open for any questions. The delegates want to question. Any questions from the delegates? Yes.
I was listening to your entire speech carefully. I was trying to listen as carefully as I could. And I was focusing on one point. One of the things that you mentioned was how, especially in this government, we were trying to mesh together the domestic policy and the international policy. But now this question is coming with the right of assumption that when you talk about soft power and international relations with other countries, it's not just state action, but also corporate interests that you invite to our country as well. In that particular sphere of international relations, where you try to attract as much corporate interest in this country to generate jobs and generate more of an improve economy basically. How do you try in that particular, in your opinion, how can a government best manage the conflict that is likely to arise between corporate action and social interest, which for a country like ours, which is a welfare state, is especially very important. How does the government manage that?
It's a very complex question. Basically, you are trying to ask me that how the corporate interest and social interests which are in conflict. That is always the case, irrespective of whether we get foreign investments or not. For example, even before the FDI came, when there were super malls coming up all over the country, malls were coming up. They were actually challenging the small shops who are your nearby. And now it has gone to a different scale when Amazon and Walmarts are coming. So the conflict is always there. What I believe personally is that you cannot stop two things. You cannot stop use of technology. And secondly, you cannot stop being open to the world economy. So it is in our interest to adjust yourself accordingly. I remember in Gujarat when a lot of malls were coming up, and as Ahmedabad, which is the largest, has the largest trading community, when these all malls were coming and the e-commerce was yet to start, even those days, the shop in front of my house, the shopkeeper used to tell me कि सर आप मुझे फ़ोन कीजिए तो मैं ₹2 का शैम्पू का पाउच भी आपके यहाँ होम डिलीवर करूँगा. And I used to tell him with a fun that for ₹2 shampoo pouch, I will have to spend 50 paisa on a phone, on making a phone. So jokes apart, so customer orientation, if it is there, then you can overcome many of these challenges. And how to adjust it. This is a nimble adjustment which the typical businessman would do. And the second is you cannot prevent opening the economy and technology. For example, now you can order so many things online using Amazon or Flipkart. You cannot prevent it. I myself use it a lot because it adds the convenience. People don't have time. So the model of business is changing rapidly, and more we adapt to technology, more we become more nimble, I guess we will be able to overcome these challenges. Yes.
Sir, at the beginning of your speech, you said that domestic and foreign policy departments are working together right now in this stage, and they weren't working together earlier. So, how are we making sure that our own Indian markets are not hindered by the domestic, by the foreign government that is there from other countries? Surely, BJP government put into initiative the Make in India initiative. But the manufacturers of our country contribute to only 16% of the GDP of the country. The rest of the sector is agriculture and service. So what is the government trying to do to protect those sectors of the country from foreign involvement, from foreign interest, to protect our own manufacturer, protect our Indian markets from completely being overpowered by the foreign market?
See, again, it is a related question. We won't be able to prevent foreign investment beyond a point. And also the scale. For example, now Samsung has established the largest mobile factory in the world in India. Now you tell me whether it is a good thing or bad thing.
Sir, it is a good thing because we are creating jobs.
We are creating jobs.
But again, companies like Micromax, which are from India, we are promoting Micromax. If we are making policies so that they are conserved, then we are also conserving the manufacturing market of India, right? So we have to make a balance between both of those policies.
The policies cannot be company specific. Let us be very clear. And when we are open market economy, ultimately the consumer will decide whether to buy Samsung or Micromax. If people find Micromax cheaper and giving the same quality of output as Samsung Galaxy, say S9, then people will buy Micromax.
So if we do not focus on...
No, I guess we can, this is ongoing discussion, you cannot go on. But the thing is that ultimately consumer will decide which is the best. Government cannot, government, if you want, what you are advocating, if you want to do it, we'll have to go to the communist system.
No, sir. What I'm trying to say is, rather than focusing on the product, we can focus on the media from where we are getting that product. you talked about Amazon and its involvement in India nowadays. So Snapdeal is an Indian company.
Yeah, so you can buy from Snapdeal.
Yeah.
No one is preventing you.
What is government trying to do?
See, we have a lot of misconceptions. For example, when the Flipkart, when we are actually digressing from our original topic of discussion, but just to give an example, Flipkart, tell me, Flipkart was before acquisition of Walmart, was it an Indian company? Was it? Yes or no? Huh?
Yes, sir.
No, it was not. It is incorporated in Singapore, and majority of investors in Flipkart in those days also were foreigners. So if you are thinking Snapdeal is a Indian company, you see the shareholding pattern of Snapdeal. Most of they are US venture funds, including one Nexus Ventures, which I am aware of it.
That's what I'm trying to say.
No, you are not trying to. There is a confusion.
To conserve the Indian entrepreneurs.
So there is, what is the definition of Indian?
So, which are based in India.
Based in India is not an Indian definition. Indian definition means when the 51% holding is of India.
Yes, sir.
So you cannot protect all of that in the global scene. That is what I am trying to say. Yes, sir.
Sir, a lot of people criticize the present government for spending a lot of money on trips abroad. So what are your viewpoints on it and how do you deal with that criticism?
Okay. It's a very common question. You are engineering student? Law student, very good. So you know what is input and output. So it is not only a question of money that has gone into foreign trips, you can sit, but also what output we have received. And all these achievements which I talked about in last 30-40 minutes is the outcome of these investments. Therefore, I don't consider this as a spend, but this is an investment. Number two, the FDI has gone up. You can check with the numbers. But most important is that the perception that this government is spending a lot on a foreign trips vis-a-vis previous governments. And again, you can do a Google search and find out how much Manmohan Singh government has spent in last 5 years versus how much Modi government has spent in last 4 years. There is a difference, but difference is marginal. But for the same period, same money, how many countries Mr. Manmohan Singh has visited and how many countries Mr. Modi has visited? If you take that calculation, then you will see that Prime Minister Modi is visiting, making foreign trips in much more efficient way and a mind-boggling way, which young people like you will also feel tired of even listening. And I can give you hundreds of such examples. I can give you one classic example, how he plans and makes the maximum use of his foreign trips. Once he traveled in the morning, he started from Delhi, went to Qatar. We had 2.5 hours difference to Qatar, 3 hours flight. So he actually reached in half an hour. First half he spent in Qatar for official visit. Sit in the plane, went to Switzerland. Again saved 2 hours and flight was 4.5 hours. So he reached into a second half he spent in Switzerland, official visit. Night he started, reached DC in morning. Then next 48 hours he was in DC where he gave a very famous address to US Congress. Then again started from DC early morning, took 7-hour flight to Mexico City. But again there was a 4 hours difference, so he reached in 3 hours time. Had a daytime visit to Mexico, started in the night from Mexico City, took 12 hours flight, 11 hours flight, had a hop over in Frankfurt where he met German Chancellor. When the plane was being refueled, because 747 cannot take non-stop flight from across Atlantic to India. And he reached here at 2:30 in the night, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the early morning. And 8:30, Prime Minister Modi tweeted that very nice to be back home, feel nice to be back home. I just finished my first meeting. So this is the kind of efficiency he works. And you will see none of his foreign trip is only going to one country and coming back. Recently he went to From India, he went to Rwanda, reached late in the evening. Next day, half a day in Rwanda, came to Uganda. That half a day and next day, 2 hours from morning in Uganda. Went to South Africa, and 2 o'clock he was in the first meeting in South Africa during BRICS summit. So this is, and I also interact a lot with his staff, and they have nightmares with Prime Minister's visit because they have to work when in the plane and when he is not in the plane. So, so you look into that part also. How many visits, at what cost Mr. Manmohan Singh has done during his tenure vis-a-vis how much Mr. Modi has done. Then you will have a comprehensive view.
I can add a simple point. Return on investment.
Return on investment. Absolutely. Yes, yes. You have? Yeah, please go ahead. Yes, please.
Actually, sir, my question is on the current topic, Kerala floods. The UAE is providing donation to our country, but India is not. Central government is not accepting the payment. And what I went through while I was reading, that we have a policy that we have to we must not we may accept the donations of UAE. So, sir, I just want to know that what if Kerala accepts the money from UAE, and central government and state government have conflict on the same, and what are the impacts on the international prospect on this issue?
There are 2-3 issues involved in it, and we should understand this in a little comprehensive manner. See, first of all, there was no formal offer from UAE to India that they will give 700 crores, so $100 million assistance. It was apparently conveyed to one of the prominent businessmen who is of Kerala origin, Mr. Yusuf Ali, who has a big supermarket chains across the Gulf countries under the name of Lulu. He apparently conveyed it to the Kerala Chief Minister that UAE is willing to do this. Any such foreign assistance, if it has to offer, it has to come from the government to External Affairs Ministry of India or of a host country, and then channel to the state government or whatever machinery. So there was no formal communication. That is number one, and that everyone accepts. This is one part. The second part, which is equally important, that even in past, Mr. Manmohan Singh has taken this policy decision that India as a country with more than $3 trillion economy, we are capable of handling such natural disasters ourselves. So it is a matter of little bit self-respect and self-pride that we should do it ourselves, unless it is a massive proportion which we cannot handle ourselves. Kerala flood, though they are severe, they are of not that category. And therefore, India has a matter of self-respect. Miss, I can give you a very naive example that if someone is ill in our family, and we think that we can take care of its cost of his treatment, surgery, hospitalization, etc. It may be severe. Most probably we will not go to someone else to get money because of the self-pride. But if it is very massive and we cannot do it ourselves, then we may think about it. So for a small country like Kerala, Nepal, when they had a big earthquake, they accepted. Even in that also, they have resisted, and they have made that only we want this kind of help and not other kind of help. Even Kerala earthquake, Nepal earthquake, if you follow, they also put a lot of conditions on what kind of assistance they will accept. So each country has this policy, and therefore India, being such a big country, it's but natural that we think that we will be able to help them on our own. Yes.
My question is, foreign investment in military will it be helpful for India as a power in world politics? What are your views about foreign investment in military?
See, unfortunately for India, we are not able to manufacture even a simple pistol or a gun in India. So So by and large, we are excessively dependent on buying directly from foreign sources on most of our military equipment, except some ammunition, etc., which we manufacture. And of course, at the high end, the missile technology, which we have indigenously developed. But anything in between, our tanks, our fighter planes, the guns, even bulletproof jackets and headgear. So you name it, most probably right now it is being imported. So rather than importing everything, if we ask those companies to set up a manufacturing unit in India and then sell it, it will create a job also, and we are also likely to get the same quality material in a cheaper cost. So therefore, in principle, the self-reliant is a very lofty goal, but we also need to see the practicalities. Otherwise, if you say that only because self-reliant we should fight with bow and arrow, then it is not in the best national interest. So we have to take a pragmatic view. Yes, ma'am.
Indian soft power, if I'm not wrong, Indian soft power also includes the culture of India. We are promoting it. So in India, the Prime Minister, like, he doesn't say it directly, but of course we all know that there is a hue and cry about the cow situation. Okay, so but then when he was on the journey, on the trip for Africa, when he went to Rwanda, he donated 200 cows and there was a meat shortage there. So isn't it contradicting on part of his that the ideology in India is something different, and then he's in a global arena, it changes. So how can we
you are confused between two. He has not given 200 cows to get them slaughtered. So let us be very clear about it. You might not be knowing, you need to do some research. See, Rwanda has gone through a very bad phase, actually horrific phase of civil war, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed only because of internal conflicts between their various tribes, etc. The current president of Rwanda, I am forgetting his name, because there was a huge unemployment there. So what he has done, a very simple thing, is that he, wherever there is a birth of any newborn in the family, he gifted cow to that family, so that there is some mean of economy in that family or financial aid, rather than giving in cash, so that they can milk it out. Then there is and slowly started stabilizing families, which was also an issue in, we take family for granted in India, because we can never imagine the situation in Africa where there are no families. The maximum number of children born in many countries of Africa are out of single mothers. And she also cannot say, I'm sorry to say this, but you take it in the right spirit, that she cannot many a times tell that who specifically is that boy's or girl's father, because she has physical relations with multiple partners. So this is such a distorted system. When he started this program, it has actually consolidated family and helped for the stabilization of family, and therefore again went back to agricultural and related economy. So in that context, Prime Minister has given 200 cows and not to get them slaughtered. Okay.
Hi, my name is Eleanor. I am an Irish student and I'm studying at Cornell University. So you said at the beginning of your speech that you think sustaining an open dialogue with Pakistan, despite its terrorism, was the lowest point of foreign policy in India. However, you're celebrating cordial relationships with Israel. Recently, the world watched in horror as Israeli troops shot on peaceful protests in Pakistan. And I'm wondering... Palestine, sorry. I was wondering, in light of this violence, do you think peaceful relationships are moral and correct with Israel?
Do you support American bombing on Iraq?
No.
Okay. So each country has to do few things in their self-defense. If in a pure ideal world, someone would even oppose India doing surgical strikes and killing Pakistani terrorist camp because they have not done any terrorist activity at that moment against India. It's because it was preemptive. So each country has to follow. Israel, you from an outsider might feel that they are using excessive force, but it is important for them to do it in the self-defense. So we should not go into the every action and reaction of each country, because they do it in the self-interest. And what India has to do is in self-interest. And therefore I am saying that the talks and terrorism cannot do it in Indian context, only because Pakistan should not see it as our weakness. If we do it, then they will say that, okay, we can continue whatever we wish to do, and still India is ready to talk.
But do you not see a kind of hypocrisy in that?
No, I don't see it. Okay, thank you very much for your session.
Thank you, sir, for sharing.